February 1952. Moscow. The winter air is sharp, a crystalline stillness pressing down on the Spaso House, the American ambassador's residence. Inside, the atmosphere is one of strained formality. A ceremony is concluding. Soviet officials, their expressions inscrutable, present a gift to their American counterparts. It is a carved wooden plaque, large and ornate. At its center, the Great Seal of the United States, the eagle, the arrows, the olive branch, all rendered in a meticulous detail. A symbol of friendship, a token of diplomatic goodwill. The Americans accept it. They offer polite thanks. The plaque is heavy in their hands. It will be hung, as protocol demands, in the study of the ambassador's residence, a permanent fixture, a reminder of the complex relationship between two superpowers. The Soviets depart. The doors close. For years, the seal hangs in silence. It presides over confidential conversations, intimate diplomatic briefings, and private strategizing. It hears everything. Because hidden within the carved depths of the eagle's bald head is a sophisticated cavity resonator, a passive listening device with no power source, no wires, and no moving parts. It requires no internal battery. It is activated only by a focused beam of microwave radiation projected from a building across the street. For nearly 8 years, it will transform the ambassador's most secure room into the KGB's most valuable listening post. The gift was not a symbol of peace. It was a weapon, and its discovery would send shockwaves through the very heart of Soviet intelligence. The Great Seal bug was not an isolated stunt. It was a masterstroke in a silent global war that had begun before the ashes of World War II had cooled. The year was 1945. Allied victory over the Axis powers gave way almost instantly to a new, profound ideological schism. The Soviet Union and the United States, former allies of necessity, stood facing each other across the ruined landscape of Europe. Lines were drawn not by trenches, but by ideology. Communism versus capitalism, totalitarianism versus democracy. This was the Cold War, and its primary battlefield was not geographic, but informational. Intelligence became the currency of power. The Central Intelligence Agency, formally established in 1947, and the Soviet Union's Committee for State Security, the KGB, were the spearheads of this new conflict. Their mission: to know the enemy's capabilities, intentions, and secrets without triggering a hot war that would end in mutual nuclear annihilation. Traditional espionage, human agents stealing documents, was fraught with risk. The capture of a spy could trigger international scandal. Technology offered a more deniable, persistent alternative. The bugging device, the hidden microphone, the clandestine tape recorder, these became the foot soldiers of the Cold War. Moscow, as the capital of the USSR, was the most hostile and challenging environment for Western intelligence. The KGB's second chief directorate, responsible for internal counterintelligence and surveillance, operated with near total impunity. The city was a maze of monitored zones. The homes and offices of Western diplomats were routinely and intrusively searched. Furniture was tampered with, walls were subtly altered, and every local employee was assumed to be an informant for the state. Embassy compound, collecting intelligence was an exercise in extreme paranoia and technical innovation. The physical and electronic isolation was profound. In this environment, any gift, any piece of furniture, any construction material offered by the Soviet state was immediately suspect. It was within this pressure cooker of paranoia that Operation Izba, the Russian word for hut or cottage, was conceived. The genesis was a seemingly mundane problem of physics and security. The KGB, like all intelligence services, relied on concealed radio transmitters to eavesdrop. But these had limitations. Batteries died. Transmissions could be discovered through routine sweeps for radio frequencies. A device that required no internal power source, emitted no radio waves until precisely activated, and was made entirely of passive, non-metallic components would be, in theory, undetectable. Soviet scientists, drawing on theoretical work, had begun exploring the concept of a passive cavity resonator. The principle was akin to holding a tuning fork near a piano. If you hit a note on the piano that matched the fork's resonant frequency, the fork would silently vibrate. A cavity resonator could be excited by a distant microwave beam. The subtle modulation of that resonance by sound waves in a room, the pressure waves from a human voice vibrating the cavity's diaphragm, could then be captured and decoded from the reflected signal. It was a listening device that lay completely dormant, a piece of inert material, until an invisible key was turned from blocks away. The KGB saw its opportunity in 1945. Embassy. A large carved wooden Great Seal of the United States was presented to Ambassador W. Averill Harriman as a gesture of friendship to commemorate the wartime alliance. This first seal was accepted and displayed, but the intelligence potential of such an ornate, hollow object was not lost on the KGB's scientific technicians. They began planning a more sophisticated version. The goal was not just to plant a bug, but to embed it within an object of such symbolic importance and apparent permanence that its presence would be unthinkable. The stage was set for an act of audacious technical deception, one that would require patience, precision, and a deep understanding of American diplomatic protocol and pride. The plan moved from theory to workshop. In a secure KGB technical laboratory, teams of craftsmen and engineers worked in secrecy. The device, codenamed The Thing by its creators, was a marvel of minimalist espionage. It was a cavity resonator machined from pure silver, with a copper diaphragm stretched across its opening. A small, tunable rod inside allowed its resonant frequency to be adjusted. It contained no transistors, no wires, no batteries. It was, for all intents and purposes, a small, sophisticated metal can. The genius lay in its housing and delivery system. The resonator was embedded deep within a wooden replica of the Great Seal, expertly carved from fine-grained lime wood. The carving was flawless, an exact copy of the official emblem. The bug was positioned behind the eagle's beak, its thin diaphragm facing inward toward the hollowed chamber of the seal, which acted as a natural sound collector. The entire assembly was then gilded and finished to museum quality. It was a Trojan horse of breathtaking elegance and cunning, its weaponry hidden behind a facade of guilt and goodwill. The KGB now possessed the perfect weapon. They only needed the perfect moment to deliver it. That moment arrived in the deepening chill of the early 1950s. The geopolitical landscape of 1951 to 1952 provided the ideal cover for the operation's execution. The Korean War raged, a bloody proxy conflict that cemented the Cold War's global dimensions. In Europe, the Berlin blockade had just ended, but the city remained a flashpoint. Mutual suspicion between the USSR and the USA was at a peak, yet the diplomatic niceties continued, a thin veneer over a chasm of hostility. It was within this climate that the Soviet Union proposed a series of goodwill gestures aimed at reducing tensions. Among them was the donation of symbolic gifts to various diplomatic missions, Embassy with a specific offering, a replacement for the now aging Great Seal plaque presented to Harriman. The original, they suggested, had become worn. This new version was described as a finer, more elaborate piece, a true work of art worthy of the ambassador's study. The presentation was framed as an act of respect. To refuse such a gift, especially one bearing the host nation's rendition of the American national emblem, would have been a significant diplomatic slight. It would imply deep distrust and could poison ongoing negotiations on other matters. The Americans were trapped by protocol. They accepted. The ceremony was brief. On a grey winter day, the plaque was formally handed over. American officials noted its substantial weight and exquisite craftsmanship. Suspicion was immediate and profound. Every piece of furniture entering the embassy from a Soviet source was subjected to intense scrutiny. The seal was no exception. It was taken to a secure room, not the ambassador's study, and examined by embassy security officers and a communications specialist. They conducted a standard counter-surveillance sweep. They tapped it, listened to it, X-rayed it. The X-rays revealed only solid wood and the metal brackets used for hanging. Their radio receivers detected no transmissions. The device, passive and metallic but not electronic in any conventional sense, was invisible to their technology. The cavity resonator, a concept unknown to Western counterintelligence at the time, slipped through the net. It was a verdict born of technological ignorance, not negligence. The plaque was then hung with ceremony in the study of Ambassador George F. Kennan, one of the foremost American strategists of the Cold War, the architect of the containment doctrine. It was placed on the wall behind his desk, facing into the room. The location was perfect. From this position, it would have an acoustic line of sight to the ambassador's desk, the chairs where visitors sat, and the centre of the room where confidential discussions were held. The KGB's listening post was now operational, but it required activation. Across the street, at a building on 5th Samotechny Lane, the KGB's 8th Chief Directorate, responsible for signals intelligence and cryptology, established a covert site. From an upper-floor window, a directed microwave beam, invisible and silent, was aimed precisely at the study window of Spieso House. When the beam struck the silver resonator embedded in the seal, it excited the cavity. Sound waves in the room, vibrating the copper diaphragm, modulated the resonance. This modulation was then captured in the reflected signal, which was picked up by a receiver in the Soviet building. The signal was weak and required sophisticated filtering and amplification, but it carried the clear, intelligible sound of conversations occurring in the heart of American diplomatic power, in Moscow. The KGB had achieved the impossible, a live, undetectable wiretap inside the ambassador's private office. For nearly 8 years, through the terms of Ambassadors Kennan, Charles Bolan and Llewellyn Thompson, the thing transmitted secrets. It listened to candid assessments of Soviet leadership, debates on Western strategy, discussions of disarmament, and personal impressions of Politburo members. The intelligence coup was monumental. The KGB gained an unprecedented window into high-level American thinking, allowing them to anticipate, counter, and manipulate diplomatic initiatives. The operation represented the pinnacle of technical espionage, a seamless fusion of artisan craftsmanship, theoretical physics, and psychological manipulation. It was a silent victory in the intelligence war, one that would remain intact as long as the fundamental principle behind it remained a mystery to the West. That mystery would persist until a series of seemingly unrelated events, a defection, a radar anomaly, and a relentless curiosity, converged to shatter the silence. This convergence began not in Moscow, but in the skies over the Soviet Union, with another audacious American technological gamble. The story of the Great Seal Bug is framed by two men who never met, whose fates were intertwined by a piece of carved wood. His identity remains shrouded, but his profile is clear, a patient, meticulous professional of the Chekist tradition. His victory was not in dramatic theft, but in disciplined maintenance. For 8 years, he oversaw the operation from the building on Samotechny Lane. He ensured the microwave beam remained precisely aligned despite seasonal changes, construction, or new window treatments. He managed the technicians who filtered the often feeble signal from the ambient noise of Moscow. He catalogued the transcripts of conversations, extracting actionable intelligence for the Central Committee. His success relied on a profound understanding of American routine, the timing of meetings, the ambassador's schedule, the cleaning cycles of the study. His greatest ally was the plaque's symbolic inviolability. He bet, correctly, that no American would ever dare physically desecrate their own national emblem in a search for bugs. His was a victory of psychological warfare as much as technical espionage. On the other side was Ambassador George F. Kennan. He understood the regime's paranoia and duplicity intimately. It is a profound historical irony that the man who famously penned the long telegram diagnosing the Soviet Union's neurotic view of world affairs and its secretiveness conducted his most sensitive work under the unblinking ear of that very adversary. Every nuanced analysis of Kremlin politics, every frank cable to Washington drafted aloud with aides, every private lament about Soviet obstinacy was faithfully delivered to the enemy. Kennan, who felt the oppressive weight of Soviet surveillance acutely, was its most prized victim. The bug operated throughout his tenure, meaning the architect of containment was unwittingly providing the blueprint for his strategy to those he sought to contain. The human cost was one of profound violation, a personal and professional betrayal that would only be revealed in hindsight, long after the SEAL had listened to his final, frustrated words in Moscow. The thing was not merely a bug, it was a paradigm shift in surveillance technology. To appreciate its genius, one must understand what it was not. It was not a radio transmitter. It had no power supply to be exhausted, no active electronics to emit a telltale RF signature during a sweep. Its design was an elegant end run around every known counterintelligence technique of the 1950s. The core was the cavity resonator. Imagine a small, hollow metal cylinder, open on one end, sealed by a thin, flexible diaphragm. Like a musical instrument, it has a natural resonant frequency, a specific microwave frequency at which it will ring if energized. The KGB engineers, led by inventor Leon Theremin, more famous for his electronic musical instrument, perfected this. The resonator was tuned to a frequency around 330 MHz. A continuous microwave beam of this frequency, projected from the Soviet listening post, would strike the device. The cavity would absorb the energy and re-radiate it back, a phenomenon known as modulated backscatter. The magic was in the modulation. Sound waves in the room, voices, would strike the copper diaphragm, causing it to vibrate minutely. These vibrations changed the shape of the cavity, which in turn altered its resonant properties. This alteration imposed a copy of the audio signal onto the reflected microwave beam. At the receiver, technicians would demodulate this reflected signal, extracting the audio. The device was entirely passive. It harvested its operational power from the incoming beam itself. Its materials, silver, copper, wood, were either non-magnetic or mundane, designed to evade detection by the primitive metal detectors and X-ray machines of the era. It was a listening device that existed in a quantum state of dormancy and activity, defined entirely by the actions of its remote operators. It represented a stunning victory of applied physics, turning the very room it spied about into an unintentional component of its own circuitry. This technological leap created an intelligence vacuum for the West. For years, the CIA and its allies operated under a dangerous false assumption that a clean sweep meant a secure room. The thing proved that the rules of the game had been rewritten without their knowledge. The search for this secret would ultimately propel Western electronic intelligence into a new era, beginning with a puzzling signal detected in the most unlikely of places. The tension between the human drama of the unwitting diplomat and the cold brilliance of the device sets the stage for the third angle: the systemic failure that allowed it to persist and the external shock that began to crack its secret open. The longevity of the thing exposes a critical vulnerability in mid-century Western counterintelligence, a reliance on known technology and a failure of conceptual imagination. The standard security sweep of the 1950s was a checklist procedure. It involved visual inspection, physical tapping for hollow compartments, the use of basic metal detectors, and most importantly, the radio frequency, RF sweep. Technicians would slowly scan the broadcast spectrum with a sensitive receiver, listening for the telltale hum or chatter of a hidden transmitter. This methodology was effective against the era's active bugs, which typically contained a vacuum tube or early transistor oscillator broadcasting on a fixed frequency. When the embassy security team performed this sweep on the Great Seal plaque, their receivers remained silent. By their protocols and understanding of physics, the plaque was inert. The X-ray examination compounded the error. The images showed the metallic resonator, but it appeared as an amorphous blob embedded in dense wood. To the examiners, it was likely interpreted as a weight or a structural bracket, common in large wooden carvings to prevent warping. The concept of a metallic object that was not a battery, not a wire, and not a transmitter, but was the functional heart of a listening device, simply did not exist in their threat library. This was not mere incompetence, it was a paradigm lock. The CIA and military intelligence were pioneers in active electronic espionage, but they had not yet conceived of a passive, externally powered device of such sophistication. The Soviets had achieved a temporary but profound technological asymmetry. The plaque's symbolic status further insulated it. The psychological barrier against dismantling a national emblem provided the final, perfect layer of camouflage. The system was blind because it could not envision the weapon it faced. The secret of the thing might have remained intact for decades longer, were it not for two unrelated events that provided the first crucial clues. The first was radar anomaly. Beginning in the late 1950s, American electronic intelligence aircraft flying along the borders of the Soviet bloc and ships like the USS Oxford began picking up mysterious faint signals. They were sporadic, carrier wave-like emissions that seemed to originate from Soviet territory but carried no intelligible modulation. They were dubbed Moscow signals by confused analysts. Some within the intelligence community theorized they were part of a crude psychological warfare campaign or an attempt to trigger latent health effects. The true purpose, illuminating passive resonators, was not yet grasped, but the signals were noted, logged and filed as an unsolved mystery. The second, and decisive, event was a defection. In September 1953, a Polish intelligence officer named Michał Golinewski began sending anonymous letters to the CIA, offering information. His bona fides were proven, and by 1960 he defected in person. Among the troves of counterintelligence he provided was a critical, albeit vague, piece of information. He revealed that the KGB had achieved a major technical breakthrough in clandestine listening devices. He described in general terms a system that used a high-frequency beam to activate and power a hidden device. He did not know the operation's code name nor the specific location, but his information was the key that began to turn the lock. It provided a conceptual framework for the mysterious Moscow signals. Suddenly, the anomalous carrier waves had a potential purpose. The CIA's Technical Services Division now had a direction: to search for a passive, beam-powered device. The hunt was no longer for a transmitter, but for a reflector, intelligence community. If such a device existed, it could be anywhere, in any embassy, any delegation office, any gift ever accepted from a Soviet bloc official. The Great Seal, long since relegated to a position of symbolic scrutiny but not physical suspicion, now sat atop a short list of the high-value targets. The stage was set for a new examination, but this time the searchers knew what kind of ghost they were chasing. They needed to move from theory to proof, requiring not just a new search but a new science of detection. The convergence of these angles, the human, the technological, the systemic and the catalytic, transforms the story from a simple spy tale into a complex puzzle. The climax approaches not with a gunfight, but with the slow, deliberate application of forensic science to a piece of wood under the shadow of a terrifying new possibility. The defector's warning about beam-powered devices transformed the Moscow signals from a curiosity into a clear and present danger. A sense of urgent vulnerability spread through the upper echelons of the CIA and State Department. The directive was unequivocal: find the device. But how do you find something that emits no signal, has no power source, and could be as small as a thimble or as large as a piece of furniture? The search had to be re-engineered from first principles. It could no longer rely on reactive detection. It had to be proactive, invasive, and destructively thorough. The CIA's Technical Services Division, in collaboration with the National Security Agency, NSA, and experts from private defense contractors, launched a crash program. They began by attempting to replicate the technology based on Golenievsky's descriptions. In secure labs, they built prototype passive resonators. They tested methods of exciting them with microwave beams and recovering audio. This reverse engineering process was critical. It allowed them to understand the device's potential signatures. They learned that a strongly driven resonator could, under certain conditions, cause a slight localized heating effect or create minute harmonic distortions in the driving field. These were infinitesimal clues, but they were clues. Concurrently, a secret high-priority inventory was conducted. Facilities worldwide was catalogued. The Great Seal in Spaso House, due to its prominence, location and origin, was immediately flagged as a prime candidate. But the Americans faced a daunting constraint. They could not act overtly. They could not simply tear the embassy apart. The Soviets monitored the compound obsessively. A sudden, obvious security purge would confirm the defectors' information had been received and alert the KGB that the game was up, potentially causing them to activate other undiscovered devices or terminate valuable assets. The examination had to appear routine or, better yet, invisible. The task fell to a new generation of security technicians sent to Moscow under diplomatic cover. Armed with the new theoretical understanding, they began a series of subtle, non-destructive tests. They used sensitive, directional temperature probes to scan for anomalous thermal patterns on walls and objects when certain microwave frequencies were simulated in a shielded room. They employed advanced spectrum analyzers, looking not for transmissions, but for unexpected reflections or loadings on test signals. The plaque was subjected to these scans repeatedly over months. The results were frustratingly ambiguous. The resonator, if it was there, remained dormant and elusive, without the specific, powerful microwave key from the Soviet building. The breakthrough required a shift in tactics, from remote sensing to intimate physical examination, but under a perfect pretext. The opportunity came in the form of planned renovations. Embassy authorized minor refurbishments in Spaso House. This provided the necessary cover. The security team could now remove objects from walls for safekeeping or to avoid damage from dust without raising extraordinary suspicion. The Great Seal was carefully taken down and moved to a shielded room in the embassy's most secure basement area, a room designed to contain RF emissions, a tempest-proof vault where no external signal could enter or leave. Here, in the sterile, silent vault, the plaque was no longer a diplomatic symbol. It was a suspect. The team, led by a CIA technical officer, began a meticulous visual and tactile examination. They used powerful magnifying glasses and fine probes to inspect every seam, every groove of the carving. Their focus was on the eagle's head, a logical location for a diaphragm to capture sound from the room. Slowly, under the intense light, they found it. A nearly invisible hairline seam encircling the base of the eagle's neck, a join in the wood so perfect it was undetectable to the naked eye from a distance. It was not part of the natural carving. This was evidence of a separate compartment. The tension in the room was palpable. They now knew the plaque was hollowed in a specific section, but they still had no proof of a device, and any attempt to open it risked destroying evidence or triggering a booby trap. They needed to see inside without breaking the seal. They obtained a low-power, high-frequency radar unit, a precursor to modern millimeter-wave scanners. When they aimed it at the eagle's head, the return signal showed a distinct, small metallic object suspended within the hollow chamber. It was not a bracket. It was a carefully placed, engineered artifact. The moment of truth had arrived. They had to open it. With surgical precision, using razor-thin blades and fine tools, a technician began working on the hairline seam. The adhesive gave way. The wooden cap of the eagle's head, a perfect plug, was carefully lifted away. There, resting in a precisely carved cradle, was a silvery metallic cylinder. It was connected to nothing. It had no wires. A thin copper membrane was stretched across one end. It was small, shockingly simple, and undeniably foreign. After 8 years of silent operation, the thing was exposed. The initial reaction was not triumph, but a cold, sinking horror. The theoretical threat was now a physical reality in their hands. Every conversation held in that room for nearly a decade had been compromised. The device's elegant simplicity was a mocking testament to their own previous blindness. But the climax was not over. The discovery was only the first move in a counterintelligence gambit. The Americans now possessed the KGB's crown jewel. The question became, what to do with it? To reveal the find would be to burn the intelligence gained from the defector and lose a potentially invaluable opportunity. A more audacious plan began to take shape in Washington. They decided to use the bug against its creators, to turn a devastating loss into a weapon of strategic deception. The silent listener was now a mute prisoner, and its captors held the key to a dangerous game. Yes, the exposed device, now sealed in a protective case, had been smuggled out of Moscow via diplomatic pouch. It lay on a table under the harsh light of an examination lamp, surrounded by the agency's foremost experts in electronic countermeasures, psychological warfare, and Soviet operations. The initial shock had metabolized into cold, calculating fury. The imperative was clear. The Soviets could not know their device had been found. To announce the discovery would be to forfeit a monumental advantage. It would confirm the efficacy of the technology, validate the KGB's methods, and prompt them to withdraw or alter other, yet undiscovered implants. More importantly, it would burn Mikhail Golinevsky's value as a source and endanger him and his network. Thus, Operation Funnel was born, a classic, high-stakes double operation. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Keep the bug in place, but control the information it transmitted. The Great Seal would be resealed and returned to the ambassador's study. The hollow chamber would be meticulously cleaned of the device. But then, the CIA would install a near-identical replica of the KGB's own resonator. This replica, however, would be wired to a sophisticated control system hidden elsewhere in the building. American technicians could then feed false, misleading, or carefully crafted audio into the device. When the KGB beam activated it, they would not hear genuine discussions. They would hear a scripted performance designed to deceive, confuse, and manipulate Soviet policy and perceptions. The technical challenge was immense. The replica had to be perfect. The same metallic composition, the same resonant frequency, the same acoustic properties. Any deviation might be detected by the meticulous Soviet technicians monitoring the signal quality from their listening post. They used electron microscopy, spectral analysis, and precision machining to reverse engineer every micron. They created a clone. Back in Moscow, the operation required nerves of steel. The plaque had to be absent from the wall for a plausible but minimal amount of time. A cover story was established involving a minor repair to the hanging bracket after accidental damage during cleaning. In the shielded vault, artisans worked with the care of museum conservators. The original bug was removed and catalogued as evidence. The CIA's replica was fitted into the same wooden cradle. Hidden wiring, thinner than a human hair was threaded through existing cracks and channels in the wood, connecting to a bank of tape recorders and signal generators concealed in a false compartment built into the study's floor or wall. The system could play pre-recorded conversations or allow live performances by cleared personnel. By late 1960, the altered plaque was rehung. To the KGB monitors across the street, nothing changed. Their beam struck the seal. A signal was returned. They had no reason to suspect the audio now passing from the embassy was anything but the candid voice of American diplomacy. The CIA had effectively turned the KGB's most prized asset. For the next 5 years, from 1960 to 1965, the United States conducted one of the most delicate deception campaigns of the Cold War. The funnel material fed to the Soviets was a cocktail of half-truths, exaggerated weaknesses, false policy divisions, and strategic leaks. SS might have obtained information, and to waste Soviet analytical resources by sending them chasing phantoms. Every word broadcast into that study was meticulously crafted by an interagency committee. The ambassador and his most trusted aides were read into the program. Their real meetings on the most sensitive topics were held elsewhere, in the secure bubble, within the embassy, or during walks in the courtyard. The turning point, therefore, was not a single explosive moment, but a sustained, silent reversal of fortune. The shock of discovery was metabolized into a protracted, controlled counterstroke. The KGB, believing they were listening at the keyhole of power, were instead watching a carefully staged play. The psychological and intelligence advantage had irrevocably shifted. The Americans now operated with a terrifying secret. They knew the enemy was listening, and the enemy did not know they knew. This state of controlled tension could not last indefinitely. The strain of maintaining the facade, the risk of a technical slip, and the inevitable rotation of personnel all posed threats. The end of the operation would come not from a failure in Moscow, but from a deliberate public decision in Washington. A move calculated to maximize global political impact and deliver a shattering blow to Soviet prestige. The silent gambit was preparing for a final, thunderous revelation. The aftermath of this prolonged deception would ripple far beyond the walls of Spaso House, reshaping intelligence tradecraft, diplomatic protocol, and the very texture of Cold War distrust. The silence of the operation was shattered with calculated global spectacle. The United States chose the most public forum on earth to reveal the KGB's secret. Ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson II, stood before the Security Council. In a calm, forensic tone, he laid out the evidence. He described the discovery, explained the physics of the passive resonator, and displayed blown-up photographs of the disassembled seal and the thing itself. He then produced the physical plaque, holding it aloft for the world's press. "This is the Great Seal of the United States," he stated. The revelation was a masterstroke of diplomatic theatre. It framed the Soviet Union not as a geopolitical rival, but as a duplicitous and dishonourable actor, violating the most fundamental norms of diplomatic reciprocity and respect. The global reaction was one of profound scandal. Newspapers worldwide carried images of the bug and the carved eagle. For the USSR, it was a catastrophic public relations defeat. They were caught in a lie of symbolic potency. They had weaponized a symbol of American sovereignty. The standard Soviet response, flat denial and counter-accusation, rang hollow against the tangible, technical evidence. Their attempts to claim the device was planted by the Americans themselves failed to gain traction outside their own bloc. The propaganda victory for the West was total and resounding. It solidified the image of the Soviet Union as a treacherous, technologically cunning, but ultimately dishonorable adversary. Inside the intelligence world, the aftermath was a seismic shift in counterintelligence tradecraft. The Great Seal bug became a foundational case study. It forced a complete overhaul of technical security protocols. The old methods of RF sweeping were now understood to be grossly insufficient. A new science of technical surveillance countermeasures, TCM, was born, emphasizing 1. Nonlinear junction detection, developing tools to detect the subtle semiconductor properties of hidden electronics even when powered off. 2. Wide spectrum analysis, sweeping for not just transmissions, but for unexplained power consumption, thermal anomalies, and reflected signals across a vast range of frequencies. 3. Architectural security. The design of new embassies and secure rooms began to incorporate Faraday cages, acoustic damping, and floating construction to prevent both electronic and structural penetration. 4. The burning of gifts. A formal, universal policy was enacted. No gift from a hostile or suspicious state could ever enter a sensitive area without being destructively analysed. Every item was now considered guilty until proven inert. For the KGB, the exposure was a deep professional humiliation, but also a learning experience. While their premier device was lost, the principle was proven sound. They continued to develop even more advanced passive and semi-passive eavesdropping systems. The incident likely accelerated research into laser listening devices that could detect vibrations on window panes from a distance. The technological arms race escalated to a new level of subtlety. The most immediate human consequence was the severance of a critical intelligence artery. From the moment of Stevenson's announcement, the beam from 5th Samotechny Lane went dark. The listening post was almost certainly dismantled or repurposed. 5 years of potentially manipulated intelligence had to be re-evaluated by Soviet analysts. Suspicion would have fallen internally. Was the compromise due to technical oversight, or was there a traitor? The defector Golenievsky's information was now publicly validated, putting immense pressure on KGB counterintelligence to find other leaks. The exposure sowed paranoia within their own ranks, a subtle but significant collateral damage. The plaque itself entered a strange afterlife. It became a relic of the Cold War. Returned to the United States, it was displayed at the CIA headquarters and later at the National Cryptologic Museum of the NSA. It no longer functioned as a symbol of diplomacy or a covert tool, but as a monument to betrayal and ingenuity, a teaching tool for generations of intelligence officers. The Thing was similarly preserved, a silent testament to a brief period as of unchallenged technical supremacy that once exposed changed the rules for everyone. Yet the deepest aftermath was one of permanent, institutionalized mistrust. The incident cemented the belief that in the Cold War there were no rules, only vulnerabilities. It justified previously unthinkable levels of intrusion and paranoia on both sides. Every subsequent diplomatic interaction was poisoned by the precedent of the Great Seal. The event did not create Cold War distrust, but it gave that distrust a physical, iconic form, a wooden eagle with a silver heart of deception. This breach of the diplomatic sanctum would have longer-term strategic consequences, influencing the very architecture of superpower relations for decades to come. The shockwaves from this exposure would extend far beyond spycraft, contributing to a slow-burning crisis of confidence that would eventually help fuel a much larger and more dangerous confrontation over the sanctity of diplomatic soil. The exposure of the Great Seal bug did not remain an isolated scandal. It acted as a corrosive agent, eating away at the fragile foundations of superpower diplomacy and contributing directly to a series of escalating, reciprocal actions that defined the later Cold War. The most significant and tangible consequence was its role in the Fortress Embassy syndrome and the bugging wars that crippled East-West relations. The American revelation in 1965 was not the end, but a dramatic opening salvo in a public war of accusations. The Soviets, stung and humiliated, retaliated in kind. In 1966, they presented a detailed exhibit at the United Nations showcasing alleged American and British bugging devices discovered in Soviet bloc missions. While many were standard-issue espionage tools, the public tit-for-tat cemented a global perception. Embassies were not sovereign territory for dialogue, but forward operating bases for espionage. This mutual public shaming destroyed any remaining fiction of diplomatic sanctity. Embassy in Moscow. Planned in the 1970s and constructed in the 1980s, the embassy building on the site of the old one became an American nightmare. Insisted on using only imported, vetted materials. The Soviets, in turn, delayed and obstructed the import process. Allowed the use of Soviet-produced prefabricated concrete floors and walls for the upper floors of the Chancery building, the most sensitive area. American security officials suspected these panels were compromised. Their fears were later confirmed through defector reports and electronic analysis, which indicated the likely presence of a massive, structural wiring network embedded during casting. The building, completed in 1985, was considered so thoroughly infested from its very bones that it was never fully occupied for sensitive work. The cost of rectification was estimated in the hundreds of millions. Ultimately, the entire upper section of the building was demolished and rebuilt with American materials in the 1990s and 2000s. The Great Seal bug had set a precedent. No gift, no brick, no piece of concrete from the adversary could be trusted. It led directly to a strategic and financial disaster, an embassy that was a monument to its own insecurity. The psychological blowback was equally profound. It validated every darkest suspicion. If the Soviets could embed a device in the Great Seal itself, what else was possible? This mindset led to a fortress mentality, isolating embassy personnel from the very society they were meant to understand. It also spurred a mirror image reaction in Soviet diplomats abroad, who lived under similar assumptions of constant Western surveillance. Diplomatic intercourse became sterile, scripted, and devoid of the informal contacts that could build understanding or diffuse crises. Technologically, the aftermath was an endless game of leapfrog. The principle of the passive resonator was now out in the open. Both sides invested heavily in developing and countering such technology. The CIA and MI6 developed Cinder and other detection systems designed to find non-linear junctions. The KGB and its allies moved towards fiber optic and laser-based eavesdropping, seeking methods that left no metal to detect. The Great Seal bug became the EXMC2 of surveillance, a foundational equation that once revealed could never be uninvented, forever changing the landscape of espionage. Finally, the incident had a lasting impact on historical perception and intelligence accountability. It provided irrefutable, declassified proof of Soviet active measures at the highest level. For decades after the Cold War, it served as a go-to example for analysts and historians explaining the nature of the conflict. A war fought not just with tanks and missiles, but with carved wood and microwave beams. It demonstrated that the most valuable intelligence coups are often the quietest, and the most devastating betrayals are those that hide in plain sight, cloaked in the symbols of trust. The legacy of The Thing was thus a world where trust was algorithmically calculated, where every wall was assumed to have an ear, and where the presentation of a gift was the first step in a technical counterintelligence analysis. It moved espionage from the realm of the agent in the trench coat to that of the physicist in the lab coat, setting a tone of sophisticated, pervasive suspicion that would define the remainder of the Cold War and echo into the digital age that followed. This deep institutional scar, a direct result of a wooden plaque presented in 1952, sets the stage for a final reflection on what the event meant, not just for spies, but for the very idea of secure communication between adversarial powers. The story of the Great Seal bug is a parable of the Cold War, distilled into a single, elegant object. It encapsulates the era's defining paradoxes: friendship weaponized, art corrupted into a tool of betrayal, and brute force geophysics disguised as delicate craftsmanship. It was not an act of war, but something perhaps more insidious, a violation of the unspoken grammar of international relations, where symbols are meant to convey meaning, not to extract it. The true legacy of The Thing lies beyond its technical ingenuity or its intelligence yield. Its greater impact was psychological and philosophical. It proved that in a conflict where total victory was mutually annihilating, the will to dominate would express itself in the colonization of intimate space, in the bending of physics to serve paranoia. The bug transformed a room, a place of thought, counsel, and private word, into a public broadcast. It made the very air itself an agent of the adversary. In doing so, it erased the final frontier of privacy between superpowers, suggesting that no sanctum existed, no symbol was sacred, and no gesture was devoid of hostile intent. This event marked a decisive shift from the romantic age of espionage to its scientific age. The hero of this story is not a daring field agent, but an anonymous Soviet engineer who understood resonant frequencies. The battleground was not a Berlin Bridge, but the electromagnetic spectrum. The victory was measured not in documents photographed, but in decibels captured and modulated. It heralded a future where security would forever be a race between concealment and detection, between the invention of a new way to listen and the invention of a new way to find the listener. Ultimately, the Great Seal bug stands as a monument to the permanence of distrust. Even after its exposure, after the public shaming, the counter-operations and the new security protocols, the fundamental condition it revealed remained unchanged. The deep structural suspicion between East and West was now hardwired, both into policy and into the very buildings meant to facilitate dialogue. The plaque, now resting in a museum case, is a cold artifact of that immutable truth. It reminds us that when empires compete without engaging in open war, the conflict sinks into the fabric of things, into the concrete of walls, the circuitry of devices, and the hollows of gifted symbols. The silent war it represents was never truly about hearing secrets. It was about the profound, unbridgeable conviction that the other side, given the chance, would always listen. And in that conviction, born in a Moscow study in the winter of 1952, we find the chilling, resonant frequency of the Cold War itself, a continuous, silent beam of suspicion, forever searching for a hidden chamber in which to resonate.